Hello, and welcome to Academic Perspectives on Conspiracism, a podcast about the research that's being done on the place of conspiracy theories in society, culture, and politics. Each episode is a conversation with an academic about their research on a different aspect of conspiracism. I'm Adam Coper, a postdoctoral fellow with the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data here at Cardiff University. In this final episode in the current run of the podcast, my guest is someone who has had a strong influence on my own research. I'll be talking with Timothy Melley, Professor of English and Geoffrion Family Director of the Miami University Humanities Center. He writes on the cultural politics of security and is the author of Empire of Conspiracy, the Culture of Paranoia in Postwar America, as well as the Covert Sphere, Secrecy, Fiction, and the National Security State. Should I call you Professor or should I call you Tim? Or
You can call me Tim, please.
Oh,
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here.
welcome, Tim. So, in this conversation, I thought we'd focus mainly on Empire of Conspiracy because that's the
Okay.
book that I kind of feel has influenced my work most. And I'm particularly interested in this concept that you have in Empire of Conspiracy, which is
Mhm.
agency panic. And I was wondering if you could just explain what is agency panic and
Mhm.
how has it been expressed in culture and politics, and how does it relate to conspiracy theories?
Okay. So agency panic is a feeling of lost control, a feeling in it, and it has many flavors and many intensities, right? But it's at its most intense, it's a feeling that one is in the hands of another, that someone else, or maybe some organization, some kind of nefarious secret agency or corporation is manipulating things significantly. Now, a kind of, really extreme version of this would be what the psychoanalyst Victor Tausk called the influencing machine delusion, right? This is a sort of a schizophrenic symptom in which people believe that they are being manipulated by a remote operator. Maybe they have a chip implanted in their brain. That would be a modern version. Freud's famous patient, Schreber, believed that God was manipulating him through a series of nerves and rays. So that's clinically significant agency panic. A more pedestrian form of agency panic is the sense that someone has already anticipated our desires in a kind of creepy way. So you open your phone and there's an advertisement that speaks to something that you were talking about, and you think, oh my God, they're they're speaking to me. They being some sort of mysterious, it's probably an algorithm combined with some data collection, technology. But you have the feeling that there is a presence that is out there that is kind of watching you, trying to manipulate you. And so, I got started in this or in the 1990s, late 1990s, by just noticing that a lot of really important writers were expressing this kind of nervousness.
Mm.
Some of them in a really extreme way, some of them in a very critical, smart, thoughtful way. And so I ended up writing about that. And I feel like I got lucky there, right? Most people come to conspiracy theories because they're outraged.
Right.
They're sort of like, how can people think these things, or how can people believe these outrageous lies? I got interested from the other angle. I was really taken with a bunch of writers like Thomas Pynchon and Don DeLillo, Margaret Atwood, Joseph Heller, Ishmael Reed, all of whom were basically embracing paranoia as a reasonable attitude, as a way of sort of suspecting that there are these social systems, these social influences, corporations, messaging systems, advertising systems, and also state security apparatuses that were doing things we couldn't see, and that to just sort of be a jolly person saying, "Oh, I'm sure it's all fine," is really to be a rube, right? So many of them openly championed being quote unquote paranoid, which is, to believe in things that probably aren't true. So that's a very strange reversal of something that we used to think of as a disease to something that is kind of now embraced as a logical cultural stance.
Right. In a sense, then, is it a sort of contradiction between an ideology and reality in a way? Is it a contradiction between liberal individualism and our actual kind of experiences in the world of not really having control over our lives?
Yeah. So there are a couple different questions. One is just what is agency panic? And then what is driving? I think the word, if I could go back, I think the word panic is, I might take that word back because I think it suggests that it's not warranted. But agency panic in its kind of classic expressions is often accompanied by a sense of panic, like, oh my God, this is creepy. This is not, too many coincidences have occurred. Somebody's controlling this. The question is what drives it? So I'll just say a couple of things. First of all, it is a sense of lost individual agency. So it's very much related to a Western tradition in which individuals are the deciders of what happens in their lives, right? If you go back to the 18th century political economists that kind of described how society works, we are supposed to all be free agents who trade our labor in the open market and make rational decisions about what we want to do. As you start to enter a culture that's dominated by mass messaging and advertising, and also starts to see the growth of huge corporate entities and state security systems that are kind of invisible or they're clandestine, they're hard to conceptualize. People have a need to start thinking about those things and explaining their influence. The problem is that the older Enlightenment theory of agency doesn't speak to those things, right? That's why sociology got invented about 120 years ago, right? There are larger systems that end up having meaningful influences on our action. So agency panic is rooted in a recognition that social systems have the power to influence us, but it's also rooted in a desire not to give up the older explanatory framework, right? So in both conspiracy theory and paranoia and what I'm calling agency panic, there is a desire to explain complicated social systems and social influences, but also an unwillingness to give up the idea that individual agents are in control, that
Right.
there's a locus of decision making and willfulness. And so if you think about what conspiracy theory is, it is a transference of that willfulness to some other agent out there. And it's usually in the post World War II era, it's usually quite vague.
Hmm.
Ironically, it's the opposite of what is meant by the term conspiracy. Okay,
Yeah.
the term conspiracy means literally to breathe together, conspirare. But when we talk about conspiracy theories in the last 70 or 80 years, we're almost always talking about a huge social system that's far too vast to see, and certainly far too vast for, there to be a smoke-filled room where people are literally breathing together and plotting. But nonetheless, that's what a conspiracy theorist posits, that there is a center of control in which decisions are being made that affect the rest of society, or maybe that individual personally. So that's what's going on in moments of agency panic. And I think whether people are panicked or not, there's a great deal of concern that human beings have lost a certain amount of control over their lives. People increasingly feel slotted into systems manipulated by algorithms and so forth. So there's just concern about whether people are making the decisions in their own lives or not.
Right. I'm trying to decide what question to ask next. I've got two different questions that I want to go with.
Yeah. Ask both and I'll
Okay.
I'll I'll
So
pick one.
So one of them is just the simple, do you have any favorite examples from the books you've studied of agency panic in a novel? And then the other question, was about your article. Was it Brainwashed, the one about the Manchurian Candidate?
Yeah, yeah,
In that one, you talk about how the way that people talk about brainwashing, that it's almost as though, if I'm getting this right, that there's a sort of reluctance to give ground to the sort of Marxist idea of ideology, and that the idea of brainwashing being this sort of thing that somebody does to you is this sort of almost liberal equivalent of how to explain influencing. And I was
yeah,
just wondering,
yeah.
am I understanding that right?
Yeah, you are. So good. So let's talk about brainwashing because that's a good example of what could, of one of the ways of understanding. It's a good example of agency panic. And let's just back up a step because brainwashing has become a salient cultural term, but it does have a history. And I won't go too far into this, but very briefly, while there have always been, these concerns about mesmerism and hypnosis and the ability to put a demon inside someone, control someone kind of remotely, the modern idea of brainwashing started during the Korean War. And the term comes from an Americanization of a Chinese term for thought reform, but it's really a brain cleansing. But the concept is very American. And the term was first introduced into US culture by a guy named Edward Hunter, who was alarmed at the fact that the Chinese had started to re-educate their population under Mao and sent them to these camps where they, according to Hunter, brainwashed them. And then coincidentally, or at this, a year or so later, a series of US prisoners of war in the Korean War confessed to war crimes very uncharacteristically. It was something that had never happened in the history of the US military. Some of them were high ranking, including a major. And this really alarmed American military officials. And Hunter then came forward again with his idea that perhaps these people had been brainwashed. The idea really caught fire, both in the public sphere and, interestingly, in the security, in the halls of the security state. So in public, the idea became a kind of metaphor for a very rapid, powerful form of robotic control. And the best expression of that, as you said, was in the film The Manchurian Candidate, where a US soldier is programmed as a kind of robot assassin under the control of his communist mother, who can show him a single card and a deck of cards, and he becomes kind of, catatonic and does whatever she tells him. So there's a kind of schmaltzy cultural history to this, but weirdly, the concept got into the American Psychiatric Diagnostic and Statistical Manual under the idea it became an official
Oh,
diagnosis,
really? I didn't know that.
psychiatric diagnosis related to cults. The idea that people would join a cult and become radically transformed to believe something very different. So, just to think about this in terms of agency panic, agency panic involves a clinging to the idea that there is individual agency, right? There's anxiety that there might not be, right? That starts with this sense of, oh my goodness, I thought I was calling the shots here, but actually, maybe someone else is. But the solution to that within, the sort of logic of agency panic is to imagine just another agent somewhere else, right? Now, the alternative to that is to imagine something like social structures,
Right.
which are very, they're very large and baggy and have all kinds of, really complicated architecture, some of which is not under any human control, but still influences us, guides us on certain paths, structures our thinking. And ideology would be a kind of version of that idea, right? That there's a whole series of institutional structures, economic structures, thought structures, ways of understanding, ways of processing what's happening that we all learn and that are also kind of enhanced by the narratives we're looking at, that are enhanced by the society we live in, and those very much shape the way we think and how we interpret things. That's a fairly academic way of understanding why people are not completely in control of themselves. But conspiracy theory and paranoia and agency panic, they want to think that way. They want to go down that. They want to explain things like that, but they can't give up the idea that there's a smoke-filled room with a manipulator. There's the mother in the Manchurian Candidate with the card
Right.
controlling the assassin, right? The other thing to just note, since you brought up brainwashing, is we tend to laugh, haha, brainwashing, what an absurd idea. The US government took this idea very, very seriously. It was deeply worried that communist forces, especially the Chinese, had developed a magical form of mind control. And the US pursued a very serious, expensive program to develop its own mind control weapon. It's a very long story. I don't want to get off topic here, but it resulted in sort of the discovery that there is no magical way to control people except through torture.
Oh,
Um,
right.
if you lock people up, if you put them in a small cell, if you deprive them of food and water, if you play loud music, if you put them in stress positions, you put them in a room that is 53 degrees, you chain them to the ceiling, you don't allow them to stand up completely, but you don't allow them to lie down. You wake them up all the time. You change the clocks while they're asleep so that they think no time has passed or a long time has passed. If you do this for a certain period of time, people will do whatever they think you want them to do. And that is a lot of what was going on in many of the seemingly magical cases of brainwashing. So unfortunately, this line of inquiry led to what is now called enhanced interrogation, which is basically a form of torture.
Right. That's horrible.
Yeah.
I think one thing that interested me from what you were saying was the role of the mother in the
Mhm.
Manchurian Candidate, and it's something that you talk about a bit in your work.
Yeah.
Is I guess, a fear of feminization in agency panic, but I guess conspiracy theories generally. Of is it a fear of the sort of masculine, rugged individual losing his control, and the idea that femininity being associated with sort of impassivity? Is that it?
Yes. And I looked at this in a series of literary, the work that I did quite a long time ago in 1999, 2000. I was looking at a series of literary texts, and the reaction I described is very much gendered
Hmm.
in exactly the way you just described. The idea that people are individual agents has a long cultural and philosophical history, and it's kind of a general proposition, but it's also connected to the history of masculinity as a series of ideas about the self. Masculinity has tended to prize a self that is walled off from society, that is decisive, that is not under the influence of any kind of control. That's why, even politicians in the US continue to describe themselves as mavericks and
Right.
rugged, sort of, they're not beholden to anyone for their actions. They're the decider, right? That was George W. Bush's term. I'm the decider.
Right.
So a lot of the cases and examples I looked at were cases where men felt feminized, or they felt that they suddenly had discovered that they were under certain kinds of social influence. And that really tends to freak a certain kind of man out. And that can precipitate a kind of violent, a tendency to, I'm going to prove that I'm not under anyone's control by enacting violence.
Right.
That would be one kind of response. That's not the only response that you see. But yes, so this is very much a kind of gendered experience and way of thinking.
Yeah, I think I remember one film that really stood out to me demonstrating that was Oliver Stone's JFK. I don't know if you've seen that with
Yes, of course, yeah.
Kevin Costner as Jim Garrison, and his character becomes so invested in the investigation into JFK's assassination, and he
Mhm.
spends less and less time with his family. And at one point, his wife says to him, "I think that you love Kennedy more than you love your own family." At the end, like the end scene of the whole film is him having gone through the trial, even though he's unsuccessful in proving there was a conspiracy, it ends with this very positive note of him holding hands with his wife and daughter and walking off into the sunlight. And I just kind of thought like, wow, that's really sort of demonstrating this thing of he's regained his masculinity in a sense.
Mhm. Yeah, and of course, the film is very much about homosexuality as
Oh
a
yeah.
kind of villainous. It reinforces the idea that the conspirators are involved in, they're part of a kind of homosexual cabal, as well as it really rehearses that Cold War logic. Now, if you go back to the Manchurian Candidate, which is, 20 plus years older, the Manchurian Candidate is a fascinating movie because it takes very seriously the idea that someone could be taken prisoner and conditioned to become kind of a robot. But the film is mostly about the relationship between men and women. Most of the scenes are about men that are under some sort of really mysterious female influence. There's a really stunning scene in that film. And so, most of all, Raymond, it turns out the main character who's brainwashed, it turns out his controller is his overbearing mother, right? You can't make it any more kind of obvious than that. But also, the protagonist, Frank Sinatra's character, Major Marco, he's been brainwashed as well, and he's kind of struggling to undo his brainwashing. And there's a scene where he runs into Rosie, who becomes his love interest on the train. And he's addled, he's sweating, he's trying to smoke, but his hands are shaking. And she lights a cigarette, puts it in his mouth, and talks to him in this kind of witty banter. And he sort of mumbles. And then she says something like, I live at El Dorado 12345. Can you remember that? And yes. And then, so it's almost like in, there's no real serious suggestion that she's part of any plot.
Right.
It just the idea seems to be that women engage in something like the control of men in an ordinary way all the time. And you see that with all the female characters in the film. And so the film is trying to work out something about ordinary social influences, especially the influence of women over men. And it's also it's doing that in the context of this anti-communist plot where it's thinking about how enemy agents could be manipulating Americans from abroad.
Right. It's also really interesting because I think that it's a sort of theme that has remained up until today. I mean, I think about people like Jordan Peterson, Andrew
Mhm.
Tate, and the way
Yes.
that they mix misogyny with conspiracy theory. And it does seem to have a powerful effect over some people.
Yeah, that's right.
But moving on to, I was just going to sort of ask more about your background and how you came to this topic. So,
Mhm.
Empire of Conspiracy, you were doing the research in what, the late 90s? I mean, how did you first get into that topic?
Well, as I said before, most people come into this but because they start with the idea that there's something called conspiracy theory. It's outrageous, it's visible, it's obvious, and it's easily dismissed, and yet people continue to believe these theories. And they start from a position of disbelief and outrage. And I came into this like really through a very different experience. I just happened to notice that a lot of the most important writers in the 1960s, 70s, 80s were embracing paranoia as a positive stance, as a way of resisting corporate and state power. And they were both embracing a certain kind of suspicion, right? A way of a sort of thinking critically and trying to think about structures and systems. But they were also literally embracing paranoia as a positive way of being. There's really the two people that most do that are William Burroughs and Thomas Pynchon, but also Joseph Heller, who's, in Catch-22, his protagonist, who's very lovable, is very openly paranoid. He also happens to be right.
Right.
All the things he's paranoid about are true. Like they're trying to kill us. And both the enemy and his own commanders seem to be trying to kill him. So I got interested in it through the idea of paranoia. I'm kind of glad I took that angle rather than the conspiracy theory angle. It's conspiracy theory is a problematic term.
Hmm.
It's First of all, it's a fairly there have always been what we now call conspiracy theories. There's nothing new about that. But the concept that there is a discernible form of thinking that is pathological and obviously false is a really new idea. It's really starts in maybe in 1946 with Karl Popper, but really mostly in 1963 with Richard Hofstadter, the American political scientist who wrote The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And since then, we've had this notion that it's easy to detect conspiracy theories. We should roll our eyes at them. And to be clear, I do as well. I'm
Right.
not defending, any of these like wacky ideas. But I do think it's problematic to suggest that there's a form of thinking that should be dismissed on its face because it alleges a conspiracy or a plot. I actually think that's politically dangerous, right? There are more than enough really bad theories of conspiracy, but there are some that are not entirely crazy. And I think even some of the ones that I find most worrying from a kind of political and social perspective often have some kernel of truth. Even Donald Trump's conspiracy theories, which I find appalling and but highly effective. Donald Trump is a master of the conspiracy narrative
Hmm.
genre. The idea, for instance, one of his three big conspiracy theories is that the election was rigged, that the system is rigged.
Right.
I think the way that he articulates that is just it's demonstrably false. But the idea that elections in the United States are not entirely fair seems to me a plausible argument, or the idea that there's a deep state, which is his second big conspiracy theory. Again, I don't think there's any good evidence that the state is plotting against Donald Trump. But I do think there is a large clandestine sector of government in the United States that directly contradicts the principles of US democracy. So even in those ways, there's something that people are kind of onto.
This is a sort of point that has come up with a few of the people that I've interviewed is that even in cases where a conspiracy theory is just wrong,
Mhm.
it's often responding to something. It's not coming out
Yeah.
of nowhere. There's always a kind of context in which it exists. And like you say, sometimes there may be a kernel of truth that then somehow gets spun out into this really strange, expansive story.
But let me throw another idea out about this. We started talking about how I got into this, and my focus was really, I was writing a dissertation on literature, right?
Right.
So I was focusing mostly on big, very complicated, sophisticated books by important thinkers that were about conspiracies or had expressed really quite clever and thoughtful forms of suspicion. And I was doing that in the context of a culture full of these other things that we call conspiracy theories that are often to be dismissed, right? They're
Right.
things that we kind of instinctively are revolted by and find, you know, really problematic. And one of the things I think literature as a discipline kind of helps us to do is to reconcile those two things and to think more critically about the role of suspicion and the role of narrative in helping us be suspicious in a productive and kind of logical, thoughtful way, right? Unfortunately, these days, literature is often understood as mere entertainment,
Right.
or even worse. It's like, for people that are sending their children to college, it's like a distraction from reality. It's a frivolous, and kind of self-indulgent sidetrack. I think that's really very unfortunate. Literature, I think a better way of thinking about literature is that it's like an imaginative laboratory where we can think about what things might be caused by, or what might happen if we continue to do certain things, right? And we can imagine it in a complex, thick way. We can also imagine what things feel like that we have not experienced ourselves. What might slavery look like? That's Toni Morrison, 150 years after the end of slavery, writes a brilliant book about that experience. So one thing I would like to sort of put on the table is that I think because literature and fiction is undervalued in our society, we are missing its role in the phenomenon of conspiracy theory. When people articulate conspiracy theories, the sort of mainstream rationalists say, well, that's absurd. There's no evidence for that. And I think what we're often missing is that the evidence exists in a kind of cultural imaginary that's full of fictions. So if we kind of zoom out to 30,000 feet and forget about the term literature and just start thinking about narrative, and we look at all the narratives that we are exposed to all the time in our societies, right? So, and that's everything from big, thick, important novels to melodramatic thrillers, television shows, advertisements that go by on buses, social media ads, all the kind of discourse that we're enmeshed in, newspaper articles, long form journalism. A huge amount of that material is organized around the idea of nefarious plots.
Right.
A lot of it is. We consume a huge diet of narratives that explain, I'm using scare quotes here, that explain how power really works. So what's the effect of all that? Well, if you're kind of in the rationalist camp, you say, well, that's just entertainment. That doesn't, we have to think logically and we have to base this on evidence. But I think for a lot of people, seeing in thick, rich detail the machinations of power, the manipulation, the smoke-filled rooms, the cynical abuse of power, the systemic abrogation of democracy. Those are nightly themes. They are depicted relentlessly, right? So just to take a few examples, in the Jason Bourne movies that are so popular, we have this very likable Matt Damon, lovable American. Poor guy, innocent guy, tries to serve his country, gets brainwashed, and now he's an amazing assassin. In the backdrop of those films, it's just taken for granted that the CIA will try to murder its own agents to stop them from divulging secrets. And in the course of a typical Jason Bourne film, many of those agents are murdered, right? But that's just in the background. So when Donald Trump talks about the deep state, his critics say, like, well, where's your evidence that they're manipulating things? I think what they're missing is that for most people, the evidence has been scattered out into this imaginary, this cultural imaginary that is relentlessly serving up explanations. So people don't demand to see the evidence because they go home and watch the evidence every night on television. They don't need to see the specific manipulation by covert agents. They've seen it a million times, right? So that's why there's no evidence required. The evidence has already been disseminated in the form of fiction.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because some of my own work has sort of dealt a bit with philosophical, epistemological attempts at understanding what is a conspiracy theory. And one of the sort of issues that I have with a lot of that literature is the way in which there's this assumption that a conspiracy theory is a particular type of belief that is, they almost treat it like it's completely abstracted from society, that it's simply this issue that you can find a true or a false answer to, and we can deal with these things in a purely rational way, like you were saying. Whereas whether or not the actual conspiracy theory is true or not, it's it exists in this cultural context where it's being influenced by all these different factors going on around it.
Yes, I mean, I think that's something that you should try to really highlight in this podcast. I mean, there's a kind of implicit debate among scholars about what a conspiracy theory is. For many scholars, and I stridently do not agree with this. For many scholars, a conspiracy theory is a false, incorrect explanation of some sort of malfeasance. I think it's much better to describe conspiracy theory as an allegation of conspiracy. It's an explanatory narrative that alleges some sort of concealed plot or malfeasance. And it's important to do that because some explanations are, in fact, true. They turn out to be correct. Many are absurd. And we do have to have aggressive journalism and historical inquiry that pushes back on claims that can be very politically powerful in a bad way. So I think it's important to push back on Donald Trump's claims of conspiracy. They are very powerful political tools that are rooted in, basically in lies. But that doesn't mean we should take the position that all articulations of conspiracy should be diagnosed in advance and kind of dismissed to court at the beginning. I think that's really problematic.
Yeah, I think sometimes that maybe what it is that people sort of feel that if they admit that there may be some grain of truth, then they open the door to all kinds of horrible beliefs when we can have that ability to discern between what is maybe hateful or totally false and conspiracy allegations that may have something to them. But you brought up Donald Trump, and we're coming towards the end of our time. So I was
Yeah.
going to just end with the classic question of what role do you think conspiracy theories are going to play in this year's election? Because you're in the United States, so I'm assuming that you're seeing a lot more of how conspiracy theories are playing out in American politics than
Right.
I am. Are they going to play a
Yes,
big role again, like they did in 2016 and 2020?
absolutely. They already are playing a huge role. Donald Trump's entire political platform is a conspiracy platform. Donald Trump is a master of the conspiracy narrative genre. It's important to remember he was a reality TV host. He mastered the logic of serial melodrama. And one of the things we didn't talk about, but I'll just kind of mention it here, is that the paranoid style, Hofstadter's notion of the paranoid style, is really it's more about melodrama than it is about the allegation of conspiracy. Melodrama is a form where there is a Manichaean divide between good and evil. There's a helpless victim and a knight that rides in at the last minute. It's usually there's time pressure and saves the innocent victim from a terrible evil. So claims like, our enemies are massing on the border, they're about to be overrun. These are kind of political melodrama. Donald Trump is a master of that form. One thing that people aren't talking about enough is the way that his allegations of conspiracy tap into popular television and film melodrama. He doesn't need to cite the texts. His theory of how the election is being stolen is taken from popular shows like Scandal and Mr. Robot and House of Cards. Those were all popular shows in his first election run. So, the other thing is that the sense of grievance he articulates in these theories of conspiracy, they're felt by a lot of the people that support Donald Trump. And those people watch a lot of television and media, and they consume narratives that support that way of thinking. So it's a very powerful logic.
Hmm. I think again, it just shows the role of narrative in all of this, and that sometimes it's not something that you can easily dispel by just debunking it.
Yes, I think that's a good summarizing point. People's first inclination when they are upset about conspiracy theories is to take a rationalist posture where logic and the careful examination of evidence will lead to enlightenment. And I want to be clear, I do that and I like that. I'm for that.
Right.
But unfortunately, the logic of narrative, which first of all is another term for narrative, is emplotment, right? And a plot is a conspiracy there is a deep connection between the logic of narrative and conspiracy theory. So the role of narrative in providing kind of intellectual support, again, in scare quotes there, for conspiracy theories is it's really powerful. It's not rational in the sense that we might start with. It operates through a different kind of logic.
Well, thank you very much for that. That sort of brought us to the end. Thank you very much, Tim Melley, for joining me.
My pleasure, Adam. Great to be with you.
Thanks again to Professor Tim Melley for talking to me about his work on the depiction of conspiracy and paranoia in literature. And thanks to you for listening. We've reached the end of the current run of the podcast. There'll likely be some more episodes in the future, but it's goodbye for now. Our soundtrack, as ever, is Spy Music by Echo Cinematics, and I've been your host throughout the series, Adam Coper. Goodbye.